About our company, AleaSoft offers forecasting services for the energy sector. We offer services for the main European markets. In the market where we have more experience, that is the Iberian market, looking at the amount of energy traded by our clients, we can say that around 75% of the energy traded in the Spanish electricity market uses AleaSoft as a reference. Our forecasting horizons go from the short term, that is minutes ahead or days ahead, up to in the long term, 20 or 30 years ahead. We forecast any data, any variable needed in the energy sector, mainly demand and price, but also renewable energy productions, other variables like weather variables, socioeconomic indexes, fuel prices, CO2 emission rate prices, and also other markets like intradays, imbalances, etc. Our forecasting services are useful for any player in the energy sector. Among our clients throughout the 20 years of history of the company are the most important companies in the energy sector in Europe. Among our clients are system operations and also distributors. We have developed more than 400 models along these 20 years, and thanks to our modeling platform, we are able to produce a high number of models, and some of these models are running in the control rooms of some of the most important TCOs in Europe. Also, energy buyers like retailers and big consumers, energy selling players like generators, or banks or investment funds that are doing feasibility studies of potential production plants. When talking about our forecasting services, we always stress three main benefits of our services. Our methodology is scientifically based. The professional staff are either scientific and trained in the energy sector for a long time. Our forecasts are consistent and coherent over time, and we have a long experience in the energy sector, mainly in the Spanish and Iberian markets, but also in all the other European markets. Alea forecasting is based on Alea model. We will talk about Alea model in detail later, but it is a statistically based hybrid model that combines classical statistics and econometrics with artificial intelligence and neural networks. So let's try to identify what we are talking about when we talk about statistical models. When we talk about the statistical models, we are referring to that models that analyze the historical data, price data, and the data of all the variables to find the relation between them, and then forecast them into the future. These statistical models include regression analysis, Sharima analysis, all these classical statistical techniques, and also the new techniques like neural network, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. The other kind of models that exist are what we are calling fundamental models. What they do instead is they try to simulate how the market behaves, trying to simulate either the behavior of each player or the behavior of each production plant, and basically they try to optimize a given target, being it minimum production cost or maximum benefit or maximum competitivity in the market. And among these models, we can find multi-agent models, game theory, blend dispatch models. We found they are useful in modeling the market behavior, but mainly at the short term, because as you go to the mid and the long term, then you have to assume too many things about how the market players will behave. So in this case, we find that the statistical models are best suited for these purposes. First, let's see the models that we are calling autoregressive models, so models that analyze the own history of the market price data. And for that, we need to understand two very important characteristics of the market price series, and they will be important in order to modelize them correctly. One is seasonality. This means that market prices has some kind of characteristics that repeat systematically over time. This comes from the seasonality present in the electricity demand, that comes from the annual seasonality of the temperature, the periodic holidays, periodic labor patterns, and also seasonality that comes from the production side. Most of the renewable energy sources depend on weather or on climatology, and that has an intrinsic annual seasonality. The other important characteristic is volatility. Currently, electricity cannot be stored in very large amounts. We can store them in small amounts for domestic devices, and main national or system levels, we can store them, let's say, for a few hours. But basically, electricity must be produced at the time that it is consumed. So it's very inelastic, and that introduces volatility. Renewable sources are non-dispatchable. This means we cannot manage their production. So we basically produce as the source of the energy is available. That also introduces volatility. And fuel production plants that has fuel cost are also dependable on the fuel prices that are also quite volatile. So first, we need to look and try to analyze and try to understand the data, because data analysis at the end is at least 30% of the time when we are modeling. We have to understand the data, filter it in order to model it properly and forecast it accurately. What you can see here is the hourly price series for the Spanish electricity market. You can already see that it is very volatile. You can see how we have big spikes that go over 150 euros per megawatt. And you can also see how we have a lot of hours with zero price. Mainly, they started to be quite regular in 2009, 2010, and recently we haven't had zero prices, but we are having quite low prices. So it's something that's been occurring for some time in the Spanish electricity market. If we look in a little more detail, this hourly price, we can start seeing the seasonality. We can see that there is a daily pattern. So with valley prices during the night hours and peak prices during the sunlight and day hours. Also, we have a weekly pattern where we have lower prices during the weekend. If we now move to the average daily prices, we can see that the average daily price is still very volatile, and we are starting to see also some seasonality at the annual level. If we move to the monthly prices, we still see some volatility, and we start seeing a more clear annual pattern. This is the average quarterly price. And finally, this is the average annual price. Now, I will show you some simple statistical modeling techniques that can be applied to the Spanish electricity market. These techniques by themselves do not have much predictive power, but later we will see that when they are combined and used properly, they can be quite powerful. The simplest analysis is the trend, to have the trend of the market price. This analysis says us that the price in the Spanish market has been increasing over time, but we see that with this simple technique we can make not very good forecast, because depending on how much history we take, we will have very different results. A little more advanced technique is a moving average. In this case, we are simply taking the average price of the last 3 years and taking it as a forecast for the given year. We are seeing that, for instance, in this case, we are seeing a clear upwards trend during the first years of the market, but then from 2009, 2010, we see that the trend has changed and is basically stable and flat. A little different from moving average is the exponential smoothing. It's basically a moving average, but where the weight of every past observation is decreasing rapidly over time. So basically, we are making the average from the previous observation, but with a rapid declining weight. And another technique is autoregression. In this case, we are taking a given numbers of past observations and adjusting the weights to get the better forecast. As we said, they are simple techniques by themselves. We cannot do much with them, but let's try to combine. The first interesting approach is combining them on what are called autoregressive moving average models. ARMA models combine autoregressive technique and moving average. So basically, in this formula, you can see what's the structure of the model. Basically, we are trying to model the price using past observations of the same price. This is what we call the autoregressive part, and then using the error of past observations. This is what we call the moving average part. And with this simple formula, we can start modeling the price. An ARMA model, autoregressive and moving average model, is just defined by two numbers. Number P, that is the number of parameters in the autoregressive part. So how many past observations are we using? And Q, that is the number of parameters in the moving average part. So how many error terms of past observations are we using? But for the ARMA models to work properly, we need the time series to be stationary. That means having a constant term and a constant variance over time. Basically, what we are asking the series is not to explode, not to have a trend, so being stable. As we've seen in the the market price series, this is not quite, quite true. So the next step, let's say, are the ARIMA models. ARIMA models allow to convert series with a trend into a constant mean series. They do it by differentiating the main variable. So the formula of an ARIMA model is basically exactly the same that we have seen. But in this case, our variable, the variable that we are trying to forecast, it's not the price itself, but the differentiated price. So a given observation minus the previous observation. And if needed, if once we have differentiated the series, it is still not stationary, we can still differentiate it several times if needed. So we are introducing a new parameter to define the model. We are introducing D, that is the number of differences applied to the main series. But we still need, so we have treated some kind of volatility and the trend of the series, but we need to treat the seasonality. To do that, we introduced seasonality in the ARIMA models. They are called SARIMA models. And at our original ARIMA formula, we are introducing terms, seasonal terms. So autoregressive seasonal terms that are looking at the past observations at a given seasonality, and error terms of the same seasonality. In this case, in the case of the SARIMA models, the differentiation, instead of being with the previous observation, can be with the previous seasonal observation. So we can differentiate seasonally. So we are introducing 3 new parameters: capital P, capital D, capital Q, and S. S is the seasonality of the model, and P, Q, and D are the number of autoregressive part and the moving average part in the seasonal part of the model. But also, in the market price series, we've seen that we have several seasonalities. We've seen a daily seasonality, weekly, and also annual seasonality. So in ARIMA models, we are using, in Alea models, we are using SARIMA models with double seasonalities. So to the first seasonality that we have already seen, we are adding a second seasonality. So we are introducing 4 new parameters: P2, DQ, D2, Q2, and S2. So to identify these new second seasonal terms. So basically, what we need to do to select SARIMA model is define the value of these PDQ values. To do that, we have several tools like the autocorrelation functions and partial autocorrelation functions that gives us an idea of what can be the appropriate P and Q values. But at the end, what you need is to test and find what are the best parameters for each case. In AleaSoft, we have an automatic platform that allows us automatic testing of a very large number of models in a very fast time. Once the model is selected, what we have to do is fit that model. That means find the value of every parameter that best reproduces the data and that minimizes the model residuals. A good fit of the model must give us residuals that behave like white noise. So residuals that have basically no information that cannot be further modelized. This means basically they must be centered at 0, constant variance, no correlations, and they might be distributed normally. Visually, this means that the model residuals should look something like that. So they must be completely random with constant variance over time and centered around 0. This means that this model is probably going to have a very good behavior. And a simple model obtained with our platform, just for illustrative purposes, it's a very simple model that modelizes the quarterly average price of the Spanish electricity market. It's a model that has one autoregressive term, one moving average term, and one autoregressive term in the seasonal part, and one moving average term in the seasonal part, differentiated seasonally. And the season is 4 because we have 4 quarters in a given year. It's not a perfect model, but it's illustrative of the power of a simple Sharima model. If we look at the residuals of this that these models gives us, we see that they are centered at 0, but the distribution is slightly shifted to positive values, and we see some large peaks that are clearly not well modelized. And what is missing in this model is obviously the explanatory variables. So we are now moving to regression analysis that what they allow us is to quantify the dependence of the relation between the variables. In electricity market price, we know that they depend on electricity demand, that on their own they depend on temperature, economic growth, industrial activity. Electricity prices also depend on renewable energy sources production, the prices of the fuels, gas and coal. So the simplest classification of regression analysis is between simple and multiple. Simple regression just relates one dependent variable with another independent variable. With multiple regression analysis, we can relate a dependent variable with more than one independent variable, which will be the case, obviously, in the electricity market prices. The second classification can be depending on the form of this relation. The relation can be linear, so we are basically having the dependent variable depending linearly, so with a given factor for every of the variables, or the relation can be nonlinear, when we have quadratic, polynomial, logarithmic, or exponential relation between the variables. Some of these nonlinear relations, using the proper transformations, can be converted back to linear modeling that it's easier to treat. So focusing on electricity market price regression, we know that the variables that impact on them are quite a lot. We have seen electricity demand, renewable energy production, thermal production in gas and coal plants, also in coal and heat production, that depend on fuel prices, gas, coal, oil, and also the needed CO2 emission rights. International connections, their capacity availability, and also the prices in the interconnected markets. Storage, being it in batteries, hydrogen, or pumping stations. And also it depends on the strategy of the market players. But in general, in statistical modeling, it's not necessary, and even it's not recommended to use all the available variables, because as you introduce more and more variables, the model gets complicated, and let's say it's more difficult for the model to really understand what is the impact of every variable, because usually also the variables have correlations between them. So we can have multi-collinearity problems where two similar variables, where we are trying to modelize the price with variables that behave very similarly, so the model will have problems deciding the impacts of all of them. So in general, the principle to follow is keep the models simple in order for them to generalize properly and to obtain the correct forecast, let's say. For example, in Alea models, usually we use around 15 variables. So when we fit a linear model, where we have to find are the value of the parameter that quantificates the impact of every variable. Choosing the correct variable that leads to the minimum quadratic sum of the model residuals. And as we've said before, the best fit should leave us with a residual centered at 0 and with the minimum variance of these residuals. Again, for illustrative purposes, we've chosen a linear model in our platform with just 4 variables to try to modelize the price, the annual price of the Spanish electricity market. We've chosen electricity demand, hydroelectrical production, gas price, and the price of the CO2 emission rights. And we can see that the model reproduces quite good, let's say, the annual price of the Spanish electricity market. If we look at the residuals of this model, we see that in this case, they are more centered around 0, that's good, but the distribution is not very symmetrical. And we can see that we have clear correlations between in the residuals. So it's not, let's say, the very best model that we can see, that we can have. But again, as an illustrative model, it's quite clear the power of the regression model, the regression modeling. Now we are going to introduce neural networks. Neural networks are basically mathematical functions. They allow to model more complex relations between the variables and also non-linearities within the model. A neural network is basically composed by neurons, by cells that are individual functions that are their input is passed from one neuron to the other neuron. Of the input layer where you input all your data, hidden layers that make intermediate calculations, and then the output layer that gives you the result of the calculation. The topology of the networks, that are basically how are all these neurons connected between them, is well, the number of topologies is infinite. You can have as many topologies as you want, and it's basically defined, but the need. Every problem has its own topology, let's say. So the basic structure of a neural network is the artificial neuron. It's basically a mathematical function. When you take an input data, you and a constant bias, and you apply a factor, a weight for every of the inputs, and you get an output data. Usually this activation function, it's called activation function because it's a function that usually has 2 states, more or less well defined. So given an input data, the output will be low, and given another input data, the output will be high. So some input data will activate or not activate the data. Usually, well, there are several functions that can work as activation function, hyperbolic tangent, also thresholds, sigmoid functions, rectified linear functions, well, radial basis also. So to fit a neural network model, it's done through what is called training. So the networks are trained. So you input them the data and you show them the output data, and through backpropagation, they self-auto-adjust its internal parameters. So what it's called automatic machine learning. So basically, the parameters are being modified step by step, trying to reach the minimum of a loss function. So loss function is a function that relates the input data with the output data, determining somehow the distance between the two data. So the neural network trains, auto-adjusts to get the best approach to the output data given a training input data. Now let's see how the specific case of Alea model combines all these techniques that we have seen. Alea model is a hybrid model developed for energy forecasting, and it integrates several of these techniques that we have seen into a neural network. It uses regression to evaluate the impact of the variables. It uses ARIMA models to obtain the time structure of the market price, and the neural network that through machine learning algorithms analyzes the past behavior to project it into the future. So again, for illustrative purposes, this is the most simple, the simplest possible Alea model for a single market. It is a single neuron that takes as the input the past observations of the time series of the price, in this case, the past error terms of the model, and the explanatory variables. And the activation function gives us an output that it looks like a ARIMA model that has the shape of a ARIMA model. For choosing the proper Alea models for any given forecast, this is a general schema of what are the steps that are done in AleaSoft. The inputs of the model are the data and the new phenomena in the case of long-term forecasting. And then the Alea model is in the center, and sorry. Our modeling platform, what we have is test and analyze all the possible models and combinations of this model that under manual supervision monitors the output and the behavior and the precision of every model, combining the best of them to obtain the best possible forecast. Properties of the Alea models are that this combination of neural networks and autoregressive and moving average models, including the regression to take into account the variables, it's the best model to determine what's the market equilibrium point at each moment. So extracting the time structure of the model price series and evaluating the impact, we can somehow get a clear vision of what's the equilibrium point of the market at every moment. And we can do that at different time aggregations. We can do that with annual models, monthly, weekly, daily, hourly. So we can somehow have a coherent top-down breakdown of the forecast. So we can start from the global vision, going down to the hourly price, and we can keep the market equilibrium at each level. So basically, Alea models are inclusive models that combine, you obtain take advantages of all the strong points of every technique that it includes, and it basically outperforms every single of its components. In very schematically, the strategy when modeling European market prices is the following. As we said, we start at the annual level, so it's the maximum time aggregation that we are using. With annual models, we modelize the price of the two main markets, central markets in Europe, France and Germany, that are also interconnected. Once we have found the equilibrium between these two markets, then we modelize all the interconnected markets, also at the annual level. And then we go down, first with quarterly and monthly models, always keeping coherently among all the interconnected markets, and finally going down to the hourly level using weekly and hourly models. And as an example of an Alea modeling, you can see a long-term monthly price forecast of the Spanish electricity market. It's a forecast that was generated on November 2010, so it's more than, so it's nearly 10 years old. And you can see how starting in 2010, so looking back 2009, 2008, it's quite difficult to see if there is any time structure here, but also in this case, the Alea model was capable of extracting this time structure and how it projected it into the future. And you can see that the registered price, the real price, basically has followed this monthly time structure, obviously fluctuating around that. It's also interesting to see how important are the prediction intervals in the forecast, because you can see how they act as some kind an upper and a lower limit. So basically, the real price fluctuates around the mean forecast and going down at the most, maybe slightly higher and slightly lower in some points of the horizon, but basically moving always inside this prediction interval. And thank you very much for your attention, and that's all.
Thank you very much, Oriol. We will answer your question now. On the Q&A menu, you can see that some of the questions have already been answered. Please take a few moments to prepare the questions, and we will be back shortly. Okay, first question. May I ask how you optimize the weight in the net? Uriol will answer this question.
Yes, well, the model is fitted and the weights are obtained basically through the usual machine learning techniques. So basically techniques in neural network training. So it's the usual way in training a neural net.
Okay, someone asked, is this only for the Spanish market? Okay, no, we use the Spanish market as a sample for the presentation, but our forecasts are applicable to all European markets. We have developed the forecasting models for the market price of the main European markets, as well as some of the secondary markets throughout Europe. Another question. It seems that the model do not catch negative peaks, and Uriol will answer this one.
Thank you, Alejandro. Yes, well, in this case, the modeling was for the Spanish electricity markets, where at the moment there are no possible negative prices. In the market where this is possible, for instance, in the Apex spot markets, yes, obviously the model can predict negative prices.
Next question. What do you mean by manual supervision? Is the model not automated?
Thank you, Alejandro. There is the model selection and the model optimization is always done automatically by the platform, but there is a step of also, let's say, manual approval, because there are some strange situations where you can have a very good model that predicts very accurately the historical behavior, but obviously when you see the forecast, you see that it's not reliable. So yes, there's always manual supervision in the case of the model selection and model combined. Once the model is selected and fitted, it performs forecasts automatically.
Okay, next question. As the machine learning algorithms and neural networks algorithms are based on historical data, how useful are these algorithms for long-term forecasting? For example, unknown effects as of today. Uriel?
Yes, thank you, Alejandro. Yes, what we have seen, and you have also seen in our last slide, we are using these models for long-term forecasting. And what we have seen is that they are reliable. They generate coherent forecasts and reliable and realistic forecasts. And this is an important point when using statistical models. Even if the future market will have, let's say, different renewable energy sources production levels, because we are expecting massive introduction of renewable energy sources, even if the generation mix changes a lot, what we have seen already in the data is that when the generation mix changes, market equilibrium is maintained at the long term. So taking a zoom out and looking the data starting at the annual level, what we have seen is market components, market players, the generation mix can change, but at some point, the market equilibrium is always kept. And this is because for a market to work, the price must be the one that makes production of energy and buying of energy possible. So for the market to work, it has to keep an equilibrium, and this equilibrium has always been present. So what we have seen in short, mid, and also very important at long term is that looking at the data, and that's why data analyzing it's a lot of the part of the modeling. It's very important, and looking at the data, it's what makes us understand the future. So yes, statistical models are what we have seen is that they are the best choice for long-term price forecasting.
Another question. In the last price chart shown, the forecast pointed upwards, whereas the real prices went down. Would your model recognize this trend earlier?
Yes, thank you, Alejandro. Let's see. Yes. Let's say the forecast has a slightly trend upwards at some point in the future. These trends, what we have seen, analyzed, what we did in 2010, these changes in the trend were because of in this case, in the commissioning of a new interconnection between Spain and France. So at that point, we didn't know when this interconnection would start working. So we somehow smoothed the the trend at the long term. So even if could see that we have an upwards trend, it is at the end of the horizon. So, but what we still see is that the model somehow is still valid. So we are right now seeing very low prices, but they cannot be too low for too long, let's say. So we are still expecting that at some point the price will somehow recover.
Okay, next question. Okay, can you provide the accuracy of the model when forecasting month-ahead prices? Can you also tell us which inputs you use for wind, solar, and demand?
Thank you, Alejandro. Yes, we have accuracy studies for our forecast. I don't know. You can ask. If you ask for them, we can provide that. In the case of inputs for wind, solar, and demand, well, are basically what we have seen in the slide when talking about the variables in the energy price. So basically, for demand, we are using working patterns, economic growth, industrial activity, weather. At the long term, we are also taking into account hydrogen production, electric vehicles, energy efficiency, and for wind and solar, basically capacity and climatological and weather variables.
Okay, next question. How often do you modify and change the hyperparameters of your models? knowing that the training data can change over time, and what was important as training 1 year ago might not be anymore. Oriol?
Yes, thank you, Alejandro. The quality of all the models is continuously monitored. So once the model are selected and trained, they perform the forecast automatically. They update automatically. They retrain automatically with new data. So basically, we are monitoring the quality continuously, and obviously when we see that something goes wrong or the model deviates too much or the model is not modeling the current situation, then we perform a retest and reselection and reparameterization of the models.
Okay, last question. How can you take into account new events that may interrupt the course of our time series? For example, coronavirus, among other phenomena that have and still drastically changing the price of the market.
Thank you, Alejandro. Very good question. How you take into account things that cannot be taken into account in the future. Let's say we have an average forecast that basically forecast the market price under the conditions given for a mean scenario. Obviously, the mean scenario is the most probable scenario. And extreme cases, well, not extreme cases, but for every scenario, we have a probability distribution that tells us how historically or how reasonably is that the scenario changes in the future. So that gives us a prediction interval and a confidence band of this forecast into the future. Obviously, very extreme cases are not taken into account in the average scenario, but it is interesting to understand that these are extreme cases. So are cases with very low probability. And this means that we can have a prediction interval, but this interval just gives us a certain probability that the price will be inside this band. It's possible for the price to be outside this band, obviously. And this is because of an extreme case. So extreme cases, let's say, are defined by extreme low probabilities that obviously make the price to be extremely high or extremely low. So we cannot anticipate these extreme cases, but we can anticipate that in the case of an extreme case, the price could be lower or higher of a given prediction interval.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Oriol. And that concludes the webinar today. We will answer the remaining questions directly by email. And thank you for the presentation and the audience for joining today. Have a nice day.